Hi, my name's Justin Bradburn. I'm a principal at CarVal, and I've been focused on aircraft aviation investing for 22 years. So for companies that own sizable fleets, I think this is going to be a very challenging few years. As I mentioned in an earlier presentation, I believe 90+% of airlines are going to be asking for forbearance. Negotiating and structuring all of those lease amendments is very time consuming and distracting. If those aircraft leases are financed with debt, negotiating debt restructurings is also necessary. And if anything, this is more time consuming than the lease renegotiation. So I think many small and new entrants and mid-sized lessors will struggle the most. The new entrants lack the experience to deal with the level of restructurings required. And frankly, many of their teams are small and don't have the bandwidth required to deal with the complexity of this current situation. But I do believe long-term, the larger lessors like AerCap and Air Lease will survive and they will flourish. So in terms of aircraft values and what we think will happen, if I look back to the global financial crisis, we saw narrow-body planes drop about 5% below base values and probably about 10% from their peak. So they were probably about 5% above base values going into sort of late 2007. We saw 10-year-old aircraft at that time drop about 25% in value. So I'm guessing that we'll see new aircraft values drop about 10 to 15% in this crisis. And that's on average. There'll be outliers that are more than that, and there'll be some that are less than that. And I think we'll see 10-year-old aircraft drop about 25 to 50% in value. Narrow bodies are and will be more stable, and wide bodies will be less stable and more volatile. We do anticipate domestic markets will recover quicker, but we think international travel will be suppressed for longer, and that will make wide bodies even more challenged. So long term, I expect values to revert back to long-term base value curves. This will take about 4 to 5 years, and this would be very typical to what we saw in previous downturns. Yeah, so I think when you think about aircraft, the challenge for when you're trying to articulate the strategy to many investors is that investors naturally start to think about airlines. And in reality, they are two completely separate things. And to try and illustrate that point, when you look at the correlation between aircraft leasing and the MSCI World Index, aircraft leasing has got about a 0.3 correlation. When you look at airlines relative to that same index, they've got a 0.7 correlation. But I think what's even more interesting is that when you look at the correlation between aircraft investments and airlines, the correlation is only 0.11, i.e. the performance of aircraft investments has very little to do with the performance of airlines. And so aircraft have shown low correlation to the market over long periods of time. Now, historically, and it is different now, I think, downturns in the aviation market, while they feel dramatic, have actually been less muted than some other asset classes. Clearly, at the moment, we're going through a real outlier in terms of that. And then I think the final point that I would emphasize with aircraft relative to other strategies, though, is that aircraft are truly global in nature. You can pick up an aircraft and you can move it. You can take it from an underperforming airline and move it to another region and put it into a performing airline. I think the crisis that we're going through at the moment is more extreme than certainly what we've seen in the past. And almost every market in the world at the moment is experiencing some level of distress. And that is unusual, and we haven't had to deal with that before. Typically, it's always been one part of the world that seems to be having problems, and we've been able to move aircraft to another part. So, for instance, when SARS occurred, North America was doing fine, and we were able to move planes to North America and Europe. In this crisis, everywhere is struggling. But having said that, we are starting to see some signs of some regions coming back. So we're seeing South Korea seems to be doing okay. Vietnam's coming back. And so that is creating opportunities for us to move aircraft from carriers where we have defaults to carriers that seem to be doing better. And that is by far and away, I think, the biggest difference between aircraft and any other investment class in terms of hard assets in the marketplace.